Among the books of the New Testament which Bart Ehrman argues to be forgeries are 1st and 2nd Peter. One of the most obvious arguments that Peter did not write these documents is that Peter was illiterate. He couldn't write at all. Ehrman says, as it turns out, there is New Testament evidence about Peter's education level. According to Acts chapter 4 verse 13, both Peter and his companion John, also a fisherman, were agrammatoi, a Greek word that means unlettered, that is, illiterate. I should point out that 1 Peter is written by a highly literate, highly educated, Greek-speaking Christian who is intimately familiar with the Jewish scriptures in their Greek translation, the Septuagint. This is not Peter. Another reason to think Peter was illiterate was that the vast majority of the people living in that time and place were illiterate, and the people who could write were not poor fishermen like Peter was. Ehrman says, the people who knew how to write were primarily men who were priests. In fact, for the entire 1st century CE, the time of Jesus and Simon Peter, we know for certain of only 2 authors in Palestine who produced literary works. That is, educated compositions other than tax documents, land deeds, or marriage certificates, etc. The Jewish historian Josephus and a man named Justus of Tiberias. Some point out that 1 Peter says that it was written through Silvanus, and that this means that some guy named Silvanus wrote the letter for Peter. However, New Testament scholars now widely recognize that when the author indicates he wrote the letter through Silvanus, he is indicating not the name of his secretary, but the person who was carrying the letter to the recipients. Authors who use secretaries don't refer to them in this way. But perhaps some other secretary wrote 1st and 2nd Peter, and Peter dictated the letters. Ehrman thinks this is unlikely. He says, Peter could not have dictated this letter in Greek to a secretary any more than he could have written it in Greek. That would have required him to be perfectly fluent in Greek, to have mastered rhetorical techniques in Greek, and to have an intimate familiarity with the Jewish scriptures in Greek. None of that is plausible. Nor can one easily think that he dictated the letter in Aramaic and the secretary translated it into Greek. The letter does not read like a Greek translation of an Aramaic original, but as an original Greek composition with Greek rhetorical flourishes. In 2 Peter, the author addresses scoffers who ridicule Christians for believing that Jesus would return soon, but had not yet returned despite the fact that many years had passed. Ehrman says, the author replies that these unbelievers are ignorant and deceived, having forgotten that with the Lord 1 day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are as 1 day. In other words, even if Jesus waits another 3,000 years, he is still coming soon. 2 Peter is probably a forgery because it wouldn't have been until well after the apostles, including Peter, died, that people began to make fun of Christians for thinking Jesus was going to return in the near future. As Ehrman says, one of the reasons virtually all scholars agree that Peter did not actually write this letter is that the situation being presupposed appears to be of much later times. It was only with the passing of time that the Christian claim that all would take place within this generation, and before the disciples had tasted death, started to ring hollow. If 2 Peter had been written during Peter's lifetime, the sensible reaction to the scoffers would have been to say, Jesus said he'd return before we died, and since we're not all dead yet, he still has time to fulfill that prophecy. You wouldn't need some bullshit hermeneutic contortionism like saying that a generation really means thousands of years. That only becomes necessary after all the apostles are dead. Since this statement was likely made well after Peter died, Peter is unlikely to have been the person who said it.